The morning of January 16, 2014, looked like any other at the Caribe Hilton in San Juan, Puerto Rico. The resort's visitors relaxed in luxury on the sunny, secluded beach. Not a single patron had any clue there was a sting operation unfolding in two adjoining hotel rooms upstairs.
In one of the rooms, a special agent posing as a Texan venture capitalist negotiated with two Turkish businessmen over expensive and counterfeit chemotherapy drugs they'd smuggled into the country.
In the adjoining room, another special agent, a U.S. attorney, and an entire team of translators listened in, waiting for the moment the two businessmen would incriminate themselves and admit they were trying to elude the United States government.
The undercover agent had the businessmen convinced he was interested in purchasing the chemo drugs as an investment, something he could later sell to doctors at a profit. In an attempt to trick the Turkish businessmen into implicating themselves, the agent let it slip that he'd left incriminating documents outlining their business proposal at his warehouse in Texas, which the FDA was preparing to raid. The two businessmen panicked at the mention of the FDA and demanded to be put on the first plane back to Turkey to escape. The undercover agent obliged, ushering them into a car headed for the San Juan airport.
As soon as the car door closed behind them, the getaway vehicle was immediately surrounded by federal agents. And the sting? It wasn't CIA or FBI or even DEA. It was the FDA itself.
The special agents were part of the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations, which was established to protect American citizens from bogus, not to mention dangerous drugs, like the ones peddled by the Turkish businessmen.
But many people believe that the FDA doesn't actually have our best interest at heart. Spectacles like this are meant to distract us from the agency's real agenda, which runs perpendicular to the health and safety of American citizens. We'll be focusing on the official story of the FDA, its relationship to private pharmaceutical companies or Big Pharma, and how the cure for cancer fits into all of this. Officially, cancer is a complicated umbrella term for various ailments with no easy single cure. In all cases, the disease involves some cells dividing uncontrollably with a risk of spreading to healthy tissue around it. And the FDA, designed to protect Americans, would never block any cure that was discovered. But we'll look into the official history and confirmed operations of the FDA to see why people think otherwise.
Next week, we'll dig into the conspiracy theories surrounding the FDA. Does a cure for cancer already exist? Has Big Pharma coerced the FDA into keeping the lid on a cure so Big Pharma can keep making money off of cancer treatment? Are there even more insidious reasons the FDA and Big Pharma would want to keep the cure for cancer out of the hands of the people?
But before we can discuss all that, we need to understand the FDA, its history, its scandals, and its purpose. The Food and Drug Administration is so much more than its Office of Criminal Investigations, or OCI, which we described earlier. While the OCI works to get counterfeit drugs and quack doctors off the street, the FDA's job has a much greater scope.
According to the government, the FDA is responsible for, quote, protecting the public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, medical devices, our nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation, end quote. The FDA also provides accurate science-based health information to the public. According to former U.S. Representative John Dingell,
it's going to help the medical profession, it's going to make Americans safer, and it's going to see to it that good drugs, safe and efficacious, come more quickly to the marketplace.
The FDA is responsible for approving new types of treatments and medications for illnesses like cancer, while also weeding out fake or harmful cures. Over the last 70 years, The FDA has been responsible for the approval of over 150 anti-cancer drugs, and that doesn't even begin to touch on the drugs that have been approved to treat cancer symptoms, side effects, or pain.
Hundreds of drugs related to cancer treatment exist, not to mention the thousands currently in development. It seems to me like that's a market that generates a lot of money.
You're not wrong. The global oncology drug market is creeping towards $200 billion per year, with close to $100 billion of that spent in the U.S. alone.
And it's pharmaceutical and research companies getting rich from this economy. In fact, it was reported by Reuters in 2018 that so many companies are rushing to get a piece of the pie, the cancer drug research market is overcrowded, which actually causes investors to stop and think before putting money into yet another research project.
These pharmaceutical companies work closely with the FDA. After all, they can't sell their drugs without FDA approval. So for the last few decades, the FDA and pharmaceutical companies have been working hand in hand towards more and more effective treatments for cancer, as well as drugs with cancer-preventing or even cancer-curing properties.
But not everyone believes that the FDA would ever approve a true magic bullet cure for cancer drug. Why? Well, look at the money. As we said before, pharmaceutical companies, or big pharma to use a term coined by conspiracy theorists 25 years ago, make a lot of money selling cancer treatment drugs. What would happen if all of a sudden a true cure for cancer popped up on the market? Every present and future cancer patient could pop a single pill, and the entire $100 billion oncology market would just dry up.
This line of thinking has some people convinced that Big Pharma has an incentive to keep a cure off the market, and these companies pressure the FDA to suppress any potential cures. But that's not the full story or the full history.
There were only a handful of laws regulating the safety of food and pharmaceuticals until 1906, when President Theodore Roosevelt signed the Pure Food and Drug Act.
In the years just before this, books like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle had exposed the unsanitary realities of the meat processing industry, and numerous newspaper articles targeted the drug industry for selling medicines containing dangerous substances like opium or alcohol. Change needed to happen, and after Roosevelt signed the Pure Food and Drug Act, food and drugs became regulated in the United States for the first time.
This was considered the birth of the FDA as we know it, and their role has only expanded since then. In 1938, Congress passed a series of laws known as the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act.
These laws were influenced by a tragedy that occurred in 1937, when more than 100 patients were poisoned to death by an improperly prepared antibacterial drug.
Congress was forced to act quickly and greatly expand the reach of the FDA, giving them the authority to regulate everything from food coloring to chewing gum, to homeopathic products to water bottles. To many, this seemed like the perfect solution to the lack of safety regulations, but not everyone was convinced.
Economists like Milton Friedman were worried that the new regulations were biased against some potentially useful products, especially pharmaceuticals, because the risks for mistakenly approving a harmful drug outweighed the risks of wrongfully banning a helpful drug.
Along those same lines, others were worried that the FDA was positioned to favor drug approval choices that would lead to the least amount of negative public attention, regardless of which drugs were actually most effective.
Still others believed this newly empowered government agency would be easily influenced by outside money. For the right price, manufacturers could be able to buy a stamp of approval for a potentially unsafe product.
Following this line of thought, empowering the FDA was tantamount to giving power to food and drug manufacturing companies. And with these new laws, the FDA now had an expansive reach, or even overreach as some people felt. Food, medicine, cosmetics, and more were now completely under the control of one government agency. How exactly? Was the FDA going to use this unprecedented power?
After the 1938 passage of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDA was suddenly granted jurisdiction over multiple facets of American consumer life. While it seems like a lot of power for a single organization, it felt like a necessary step to protect the public from dangerous additives and pharmaceuticals.
But some people felt like the FDA's new responsibilities bordered on overreach. The agency now had the power to decide which painkillers were on drugstore shelves and which treatments doctors could prescribe. They could even prevent American citizens from seeking out treatments they hadn't yet approved.
At the same time, many people trusted the mission statement of the FDA to promote and protect public health. And by and large, that's what they did. Along with protecting the population from fake drugs, like the OCI sting in Puerto Rico, they're also responsible for reviewing research on new medications, helping to bring new life-saving drugs to the market.
But the problem with the FDA is that it's a big ship. As a government entity, it moves very slowly, sometimes taking years to approve a single drug.
Things started changing in 1992 when the FDA and Congress failed to quickly and effectively respond to the AIDS crisis. During the epidemic, the FDA's lengthy drug approval process became a subject of scrutiny, targeted at rallies like this one.
Understand clearly our message. We march not just for AIDS, but for increased research for all life-threatening diseases. For people with cancer, we march with you today. For people with Alzheimer's, we march with you today. For people fighting heart disease, we march with you today.
According to Douglas Crimp, an activist with the AIDS advocacy group ACT UP, the delays in the approval process, which sometimes lasted upwards of 2 years, were responsible for the thousands of AIDS-related deaths each year. ACT UP slogans, which included, quote, "We die, they do nothing," end quote, and, quote, "We recognize every AIDS death as an act of racist, sexist, and homophobic violence," end quote, were directly aimed at the FDA.
The FDA knew its process was taking too long, but they couldn't just snap their fingers and speed things up, especially not without cutting corners that could potentially harm millions of people. They needed more manpower than their congressional funding could give them. It was actually the demonstrations by ACT UP activists that finally inspired the FDA and Congress to create the Prescription Drug User Fee Act of 1992.
The Prescription Drug User Fee Act set up a system that let the FDA collect fees directly from pharmaceutical companies to fund the drug approval process. Previously, the FDA had only been able to operate using the meager funding Congress earmarked for them annually. Under the new system, drug companies would pay a fee for their drug reviews, which the FDA would use to hire more workers and speed up the process.
But there was pushback from pharmaceutical companies who worried that the fees collected from them wouldn't actually be used to benefit them.
The FDA agreed to set target completion times for the approval process to ensure they were holding up their end of the bargain, and the law was passed.
With this new system in place, the approval process was flying. The additional source of funding, along with congressional appropriations, helped the FDA do its job both faster and more efficiently.
A 2002 U.S. General Accounting Office report noted that in 8 years, the FDA was able to increase its drug review staff by 77%, and the median drug approval time dropped from over 2 years to just 14 months. I'd call that a success, if the only metric we're measuring is how fast the process moves.
For the thousands of people with HIV and AIDS who needed immediate access to life-saving medications, speed was the most important metric. In the years since, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act has proven to be a necessary step to ensure American citizens have timely access to cutting-edge medical treatments.
But it was also a controversial step, and it would eventually thrust the FDA under even more public scrutiny. For some, this new funding system could easily mean that the FDA is now in the pocket of Big Pharma.
These worries over conflicts of interest or pay-for-play scandals are made worse by the fact that the FDA actually has been caught misbehaving more than once.
In 2010, one of the largest drug makers in the world, AstraZeneca, presented clinical data on their new drug Brilinta, which promised to prevent strokes and heart attacks. It was an exciting drug for the panel of medical researchers attending the presentation, and they approved it.
The FDA has systems in place to root out any conflicts of interest that might crop up during these review panels. If any of the potential panelists had financial ties to the presenting drug company, they wouldn't be allowed to join. And in this particular panel, everything checked out.
Brilinta went on to become what's called a blockbuster drug, a pharmaceutical that goes on to bring in millions or billions of dollars. And that's where things start to get tricky.
While none of the voting panelists had any financial ties to AstraZeneca before the review, 4 of the doctors on the panel were handsomely rewarded by the company afterwards. One of the panelists, cardiologist Jonathan Halperin, was paid over $200,000 in the form of fees for work he did for AstraZeneca after the initial drug review vote.
This is only one example of an ongoing pattern, according to a Science magazine article from 2018. The FDA has no system in place to combat this type of pay-later conflict of interest, and it goes, quote, largely unnoticed and entirely unpoliced.
By examining records from FDA panels and pharmaceutical companies from 2008 to 2014, the magazine found that these kind of pay-later conflicts are not only widespread, but the FDA has taken no measures to prevent them.
So while there are supposedly systems in place to prevent conflicts of interest, those systems don't go far enough to actually stop the problem. How can we be sure that the FDA actually has the best interest of the public at heart when they've codified taking money from pharmaceutical companies in the form of funding and in the form of bribery?
As it turns out, these conflicts of interest may not actually influence which drugs get approved. In fact, in 2018, Policy and Medicine published a study that found intense restrictions on conflicts of interest may actually do more harm than good.
This study, conducted by the Law and Economics Center at George Mason Law School, found that, quote, limiting the number of conflicted experts who can serve on advisory committees presents its own costs associated with finding qualified, non-conflicted members and appointing less qualified members.
Essentially, by barring the most qualified experts because of conflicts of interest, the panels end up being comprised of less qualified candidates.
Additionally, the center found that, quote, decisions by advisory committees with conflicted members were more likely to be consistent with both the ultimate FDA decision as well as stock market predictions than non-conflicted advisory committees.
Simply put, panels with conflicts of interest actually tend to do a better job than panels with no conflicts. For some, this study showed that all the fears about the FDA's potential for corruption and bribery were without merit. Not only does the FDA have systems in place to fight corruption, it may not even need those systems at all.
But that doesn't mean that the funding system put in place by the Prescription Drug User Fee Act doesn't open up the FDA to any problems. As stipulated by the Act, the FDA is now required to live up to certain benchmarks, whether it's in the public's interest or not. Here's Bart Stupak from the House Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee.
PDUFA requires the FDA to quickly bring new drugs to the market. In its rush to approve new drugs, the FDA's ability to ensure a safe drug supply has been greatly compromised.
As we mentioned before, one of the goals of the Act was for the FDA to provide a ruling on new drug applications within 1 year. This was one of the more important stipulations for the pharmaceutical companies. Without holding the FDA to benchmarks, there was no way to ensure the fees would be properly earmarked.
But forcing the FDA to meet these time limits could cause problems of their own. Among medical professionals, there were worries that the FDA may need to cut corners during the drug review process in order to meet that one-year benchmark.
After PDUFA passed, the FDA offered multiple expedited review processes: priority review, which resulted in a 6-month review process, as well as fast track, accelerated approval, and breakthrough therapy, all of which intended to get drugs on the market faster.
In a 2017 opinion article in the British Medical Journal, Peter Doshi, assistant professor at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy, questioned the merits of this new expedited system. According to Doshi, a study conducted by the British Medical Journal itself found that, quote, drugs approved through expedited regulatory pathways were associated with a 7 to 106% higher rate change to important sections of drug safety labeling, and less than 5% of the changes described reduced risk to patients.
What that means is that drugs pushed through these speedy approval processes were more likely to have additional safety warnings added after they were put on the market than drugs that went through the regular process.
Other studies have found similar findings. In 2017, the Mayo Clinic published a study that questioned whether new cancer drugs rushed to market were actually helping patients live longer. The study found that between 2009 and 2014, 56% of cancer drugs approved under the FDA's accelerated approval program, quote, did not have supporting evidence backing overall survival benefit.
By comparison, 37% of non-accelerated drugs were lacking evidence proving survival benefit. Still not a great figure, but much lower than the accelerated program.
Well, the question is this just an unfortunate result of the hasty approval process, or are certain pharmaceutical companies actually pumping out ineffective drugs with the FDA's help for their own profit?
When we come back, we'll examine how Big Pharma pressures the FDA to feed the billion-dollar cancer treatment market.
It seems like pharmaceutical companies have the motive and means to put pressure on the FDA to approve new treatments, hoping each one will be a billion-dollar blockbuster. The faster they can get drugs onto the market, the faster they can start making money.
And the FDA has to live up to this pressure, as outlined by their agreements in the Prescription Drug User Fee Act.
It makes me wonder what other kinds of pressure Big Pharma might put on the FDA.
As we mentioned earlier, the cancer drug market in the United States alone is approaching $100 billion per year. That's all money cancer patients pay for medications, treatments, and side effect management. Relatively few cancers have a cure, and many oncology doctors still prefer to use the more conservative term, remission, even for cancer patients who have been cancer-free for years.
Even if we assume pharmaceutical companies have the purest motivations, from a business perspective, anything that might slow that money train down would be bad news, which raises the question: if medical researchers uncovered a cure for a disease as common and profitable as cancer, would Big Pharma have an incentive to bury that magic bullet?
While some people believe pharmaceutical companies have an incentive to hide cures for diseases like cancer in order to keep making money from treatment drugs, it's worth noting that a possible cure for cancer would probably become a blockbuster drug of the highest order. As Michael Little from Good News Network points out, quote, if you operate a pharmaceutical company that has a cure for all forms of cancer, what would you do? Would any for-profit business keep it quiet and release incrementally better drugs without any guarantee of making back the money they've invested? It seems like an easy choice. Take the billions along with the Nobel Prize and your place in history.
Speaking of history, if we're going to get into the relationship between Big Pharma, the FDA, and cancer treatment, it would help for us to start at the beginning.
Cancer isn't actually one single disease. It's a grouping of over 100 types of diseases marked by an abnormal growth of cells, ranging from the well-known breast or skin cancers to more rare forms such as multiple myeloma.
Almost 2 million people per year are diagnosed with cancer in the United States alone, and over 500,000 people die of cancer per year. Cancer is so common among humans, about 1 in 3 people will receive a diagnosis in their lifetime.
And it isn't a modern phenomenon. Cancer has affected humans since the beginning. In fact, we've discovered descriptions of cancer on ancient Egyptian papyrus, dating from around 2500 BCE.
As long as the disease has been around, humans have needed to treat it. While the Egyptians preferred cauterization, a method in which the afflicted area is burned away, the ancient Greeks preferred humor theory, trying to balance the 4 fluids of the body: yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. Treatments under this theory included everything from dietary changes and herbal medicines to laxatives and emetics, blistering the skin with hot irons, or even bloodletting.
It's safe to say these early treatments would not live up to today's FDA standards.
It took a while for treatments to improve. Until fairly recently, doctors and researchers had no way of knowing what exactly cancer was or what caused it. During the early 1700s, it was assumed that acidic lymph fluid was the culprit. Other doctors believed cancer was a type of poison or that it was contagious.
Finally, when the use of microscopes became more widespread, the process of metastasis, the spread of a pathogen from an initial site to a second site, was discovered, and humanity was on its way to discovering proper cancer treatments.
Surgery became a main mode of cancer treatment, and as science and technology improved, researchers landed on the well-known cancer treatments we use today: chemotherapy, radiation, and immunotherapy. But up until the creation of the FDA in 1906, treatments were not regulated by a centralized governing body, and because of this, many Americans fell victim to unscientific or quack treatments.
These treatments included urine therapy, that is, consuming your own urine, colon cleansing through laxatives and enemas, and even consuming herbs known to promote tumor growths. Some of these practices are still used in alternative medicine communities today.
Actual licensed doctors and medical researchers have come to a much more sophisticated understanding of cancer, but they still haven't found a single magic bullet cure. Current wisdom holds that no such cure may be possible at all.
As mentioned before, cancer is a complex condition with over 100 different types, all affecting different parts of the body in vastly different ways. According to neuro-oncologist Dr. Roger Stoop,
we are very careful in oncology talking about cure because tumors may recur also later on. But the objective is to maintain quality of life, maintain activity, maintain independence.
Some cancers, like breast or lymph cancers, cause tumors to grow inside the body. Others, like multiple myeloma, form holes in bones. And still others, like basal cell carcinoma, simply form bumps that don't spread and can be safely removed in an outpatient procedure.
Whatever the cancer, and no matter how rare, we currently have some way to at least attempt to treat it. And while certain cancers, such as pancreatic or mesothelioma, have very low survival rates, pharmaceutical companies can at least help patients manage pain and feel more comfortable.
Given the complex nature of cancer, it's very unlikely we'll ever discover a single one-size-fits-all cure. Just like there's no single cure for all the problems that can happen to your teeth or your brain or your heart, there's unlikely to be a single treatment for all the different kinds of abnormal cell growth.
But that doesn't stop researchers from trying. With diseases like cancer, which affects a third of the population and sometimes has mortality rates as high as 100%, pharmaceutical companies have a lot of incentive both financially and morally, to continue working to find better treatments. It's important for the FDA to work alongside them, ensuring these treatments are actually safe and effective.
As we've said before, the FDA has faced criticism in the past for rushing drugs through the review process. But they've also been able to keep a number of ineffective and sometimes dangerous treatments from making their way onto the market.
Earlier, we touched on the idea of urine therapy as a form of cancer treatment. As disgusting as it sounds, urine therapy is still used around the world, even right here in the United States.
Let's be clear. There is no scientific evidence that drinking urine is an effective treatment for any illness, including cancer. In fact, it can be incredibly dangerous. Urine is a waste product which our bodies work to expel for a reason. Often, it can be contaminated with bacteria that cause problems of their own like strep and staph infection.
Urine also contains salt, ammonia, and other potentially harmful toxins in concentrated amounts. Re-ingesting those substances can put extra stress on the body's natural detoxification organs, like the liver and kidney, as they're forced to refilter the concentrated toxins a second time.
For anyone with a compromised immune system or a weakened constitution, for example, a cancer patient, ingesting these toxins can damage an already ill body. Harmful treatments like these present a threat to public health and catch the FDA's attention.
One high-profile example is the Burzynski Clinic in Texas. The clinic, founded by Stanislaw Burzynski, a PhD graduate from the Medical Academy in Lublin, claims to have developed an experimental cancer treatment known as antineoplaston therapy.
Antineoplaston refers to urine-derived peptides. Burzynski developed the treatment in the 1970s and continues to treat people with it today, claiming great success with his patients. However, there's no evidence supporting these claims of success. Independent scientists haven't been able to reproduce Burzynski's reported results, and no evidence from randomized trials shows antineoplastons have any ability to treat or cure cancer.
Unsurprisingly, the Burzynski Clinic has faced criticisms over their lack of evidence, as well as the treatment's high cost, around $9,000 a month per patient. Burzynski himself has almost had his medical license revoked and been at the center of multiple lawsuits.
In 2009, the FDA formally warned the Burzynski Clinic that their unapproved treatments were unlawful. After an investigation, the FDA found that the clinic did not take proper precautions to minimize risk to patients, did not continue reviews for their studies, and did not provide written procedures or documents to the FDA.
In 2012, the FDA found that the clinic was still failing to comply with necessary guidelines and possibly harming patients with their unapproved methods, and yet the clinic remained open with no legal repercussions.
The FDA investigated the Burzynski Clinic again in 2013 after a child patient died while receiving treatment. Since then, the clinic and the FDA have been in what amounts to a game of tug-of-war, the Burzynski Clinic trying to peddle its unscientific treatments and the FDA working to stop them.
But the clinic is still open, despite the multiple warnings, investigations, and violations. It makes you wonder how hard the FDA is actually trying to shut them down. Well, some people believe Stanislaw Burzynski must have some serious pull with some powerful people.
In 2014, David Gorski, a surgical oncologist and skeptical journalist, was outraged after the FDA decided to allow a small group of cancer patients to receive access to Burzynski's treatments. In an article on science-based medicine, Gorski wrote, quote, "These organizations are supposed to protect the public from practitioners like Burzynski, but all too often, they fail at their charges, in this case spectacularly."
Why would the FDA, which is responsible for protecting and promoting public health, allow the Brzezinski Clinic to treat patients with at best ineffective or at worst harmful pseudo-scientific treatments? And if the relatively tiny Brzezinski Clinic can operate outside without repercussions, what could billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies do? Does Big Pharma have the power to pressure the FDA into letting them sell ineffective or harmful treatments in the name of profit?
It's not a far-fetched concern. In fact, in 1969, the former commissioner of the FDA, Dr. Herbert L. Lee, Jr., was quoted in the New York Times saying that during his tenure, he was under, quote, constant, tremendous, sometimes unmerciful pressure, end quote, from pharmaceutical companies.
Dr. Lee was an American physician, Harvard alum, and World War II vet, eventually appointed commissioner of the FDA by President Lyndon B. Johnson. But Lee's time at the FDA was turbulent and short. He was ousted after only a year and a half.
The FDA grew drastically under Dr. Lee's brief tenure, but also faced growing pains as he went to bat with unscrupulous pharmaceutical companies trying to bypass FDA guidelines. Lee clashed repeatedly with drug manufacturers, and by the end of his tenure, more than 300 drugs had been taken off the market after being deemed ineffective.
After his removal in 1969, Dr. Lee spoke candidly about his concerns that the FDA was putting public health at risk due to pressure from Big Pharma. He said, quote, "The thing that bugs me is that the people think the FDA is protecting them. It isn't. What the FDA is doing and what the public thinks it's doing are as different as night and day."
More recent criticisms of the FDA coming from those within are rare, but they do happen. In 2005, Dr. David Graham, a senior scientist within the FDA's Office of Drug Safety, told CBS News, quote, "I know that FDA is responsible for 100,000 people being injured, and FDA wants to keep that swept under the rug, nice and quiet."
Specifically, Dr. Graham was referencing Vioxx, a painkiller the FDA left on the market for 5 years, even when presented with evidence that the drug increased the risk of both heart attacks and strokes. Graham said,
FDA still makes bad decisions when it comes to patient safety because it favors unsafe medicines in the interests of industry over those of the patients it's there to protect.
But why would the FDA knowingly leave dangerous drugs on the market? Well, as the CBS article reported, quote, "Part of the problem is the way the FDA is funded. Approximately half of the FDA budget comes from the drug industry itself in the form of fees paid to speed up the process of drug approval," end quote. So we're back to the issue of Big Pharma funding and therefore being able to pressure the FDA. And people within the FDA are calling out this problem.
It goes even deeper than that. Dr. Graham also accused the FDA itself of using intimidation tactics against scientists that questioned the safety of various fast-track drugs, an allegation the FDA denies.
Dr. Graham said that, quote, "FDA has a system in place now that will guarantee that unsafe drugs will remain on the market. The people who approve the drug in the first place take pride in the fact that they've brought a drug to the market. This is their baby."
Regardless of the criticism, the FDA continues to approve more and more treatments for diseases like cancer, hoping each one might save lives, and some of them actually look pretty promising.
In 2019, a team of Israeli scientists from Accelerated Evolution Biotechnologies Limited announced they were closing in on a cure to end all cancers. AEB's chairman, Dan Arador, stated, quote, "We believe we will offer in a year's time a complete cure for cancer."
The drug, called Mutato, which stands for multi-target toxin, was referred to as, quote, "on the scale of a cancer antibiotic," a disruption technology of the highest order.
Dan Arador went on to explain, quote, "Our cancer cure will be effective from day one, will last a duration of a few weeks, and will have no or minimal side effects at a much lower cost than other treatments on the market."
It's an incredible breakthrough, but if you think it sounds too good to be true, well, you're not alone. Dr. Len Lichtfield, Chief Medical Officer of the American Cancer Society, said, quote, "It goes without saying, we all share aspirational hope that they are correct. Unfortunately, we must be aware that this is far from proven as an effective treatment for people with cancer, let alone a cure."
Before it can be called a cure, Mutato must be subject to peer review and clinical trials. Still, these breakthroughs highlight just how far we've come. Only a few decades ago, most cancers were a gruesome death sentence. Today, even though they require intensive treatment, some cancers are borderline curable. Who knows what other breakthroughs are on the horizon?
But even promising potential cures like Mutato still have to face the scrutiny of the FDA before they can enter the market for patient use.
And some people believe that a true cure for all cancers, like the one Mutato claims to be, would never meet approval from the FDA, all because of the financial hit Big Pharma could take if the cancer treatment market were to suddenly dry up.
But that line of thinking veers into conspiracy theory territory, so we'll wrap up the first part of our discussion here.
Next week, we'll explore some of the conspiracy theories surrounding the FDA, Big Pharma, and cancer. Conspiracy theory number 1. A cure for cancer has already been discovered, but Big Pharma coerces the FDA to keep it secret via bribery so they can continue selling expensive cancer treatments.
Conspiracy theory number 2. Rich elite families like the Rockefellers manipulate the FDA and pharmaceutical companies into keeping possible cures for cancer either illegal or secret. Some believe these elite groups even intentionally cause cancer in the general public so they can carry out their depopulation agenda.
And conspiracy theory number 3. Charitable organizations like Susan G. Komen or the Live Strong Foundation actually profit off of cancer patients, and they exert their power to suppress any cures for cancer so that they can continue making money off charitable donations.
Understanding the relationship between the FDA and Big Pharma is complicated. Understanding what it takes to cure cancer is even more complicated. And with all the controversy and scandal there's been surrounding these entities, it's easy to see why conspiracy theorists might be suspicious. On March 4th, 2016, 20-year-old engineering student Neil Fashion's entire life changed in an instant. After brushing off a handful of troublesome symptoms like dizziness and double vision, Neil suddenly found himself struggling with simple tasks like writing and even swallowing.
His doctors ordered an MRI and discovered Neil was suffering from a rare form of brain cancer, diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, or DIPG. The tumor on his brainstem was incurable, and Neil was given a year to live.
Refusing to go down without a fight, Neil and his parents thrust themselves into the search for a cure, digging deep into alternative and experimental treatments, eventually consulting the Brzezinski Clinic. The Texas-based clinic focuses on anti-neoplaston therapy, treating cancer with peptides derived from urine.
With little to lose, Neil and his family flew to Houston. Neil had a catheter inserted into his chest to deliver anti-neoplaston therapy, that is urine, every 4 hours on the dot. He received treatment for exactly 1 day before the FDA stepped in, immediately ordering the treatments to stop.
Citing the possible dangerous side effects of the Brzezinski Clinic's untested and unapproved therapies, the FDA feared the treatment might actually do more harm than good.
But with only a year left to live, Neil couldn't help but wonder, what did he have to lose? And why would the FDA stop a terminally ill patient from trying an untested treatment that could, at worst, kill them faster, and at best, provide a miracle?
After Neil Fashion's clinical trial at the Brzezinski Clinic was shut down by the FDA, his family sued the government agency for the ability to resume treatments. Staring down the barrel of a highly publicized lawsuit, the FDA eventually relented and allowed Neil to return to the clinic.
This wasn't the first time the FDA tangled with the Brzezinski Clinic, as we discussed last week, and it probably won't be the last. And it's cases like these, cases where a patient's facing the end of their life, that give some people pause, wondering why the FDA would want to halt experimental treatments.
As we mentioned last week, the anti-neoplaston therapy used by the Brzezinski Clinic can actually do more harm than good, especially for cancer patients whose bodies are already weakened. That's why the FDA insists on shutting it down.
But if a patient's cancer is certain to kill them anyway, how could an unapproved treatment possibly make things worse? Is the FDA truly concerned about keeping these patients from harm? Or do they have another motivation to deny access to these controversial therapies?
Our first theory is the most well-known conspiracy theory surrounding the cure for cancer, specifically that a cure already exists and is hidden from the public.
Currently, treatment and management for most, if not all, cancers requires a combination of different drugs, radiation, and other treatments. Pharmaceutical companies make money from each treatment for each patient. If cancer were suddenly curable with a single medicine, Big Pharma would stand to lose millions, if not billions of dollars in revenue every year. In terms of cold, hard cash, that seems to make sense.
Not so fast. It turns out the math doesn't actually add up. But there is an intriguing reason why this conspiracy theory exists. Let's go back to the beginning and explore how it came to be.
The FDA and Big Pharma haven't exactly been scandal-free entities. While the FDA has been criticized for taking too long to approve life-saving drugs, or conversely, approving dangerous drugs without enough testing, those scandals pale in comparison to the kinds of corruption Big Pharma has been accused of. For example, in 1999, 52-year-old Darlene Coker, a massage therapist and mother in small-town Texas, sued the powerhouse pharmaceutical company Johnson & Johnson, claiming one of their products was responsible for her mesothelioma.
Mesothelioma is a rare type of cancer affecting the connective tissues around the lungs, heart, and abdomen. It typically develops when a person is exposed to asbestos. Tiny asbestos fibers embed themselves in the tissue, triggering abnormal and aggressive cell growth.
Mesothelioma is primarily diagnosed in mine workers, or in builders whose industries used asbestos before its dangers were understood. So how did a middle-aged mom with no known asbestos exposure find herself diagnosed with such an illness?
Personal injury lawyer Herschel Hobson had a good idea of the culprit: talcum powder. Talc and asbestos are often found occurring alongside each other in nature. It's very possible that during the process of mining talc, which is otherwise harmless, asbestos can easily make its way into the product as well.
Talcum powder has been used for years to keep babies' skin soft and dry, as well as for adult skin care. If you've ever used it, you know that even the smallest application sends hundreds of thousands of particles into the air. It's easy to breathe in. And it's a product that Darlene Coker had used on her two daughters and herself for as long as she could remember.
Claiming that the undisclosed presence of asbestos in its talcum powder had caused her mesothelioma, Darlene sued Johnson & Johnson for damages. Johnson & Johnson denied the claim, stating that their talcum powder was asbestos-free. They were able to avoid turning over their internal company test records to the court, and without those test records, Darlene didn't have a case.
But 20 years later, those exact test records would come to light. In 2018, lawyers brought a class action lawsuit against Johnson & Johnson, with tens of thousands of plaintiffs claiming that talcum powder caused their mesothelioma and ovarian cancer diagnoses.
Unfortunately, Darlene died before this lawsuit was filed, but her initial case laid the groundwork. Facing 11,700 plaintiffs, Johnson & Johnson was now compelled to release the testing records they'd covered up the first time around. Here's an interview with one of the plaintiffs, Gail Ingham.
The money really isn't the important part. It's for women to find out what was in talc and get it off there. And that maybe one or more will never have to go through this, or you won't put it on your babies.
Amongst the test reports indicating their products were safe, there were also a number of reports that for many years, from at least 1971 to 2000, Johnson & Johnson's talcum powder sometimes tested positive for asbestos. What's more, Johnson & Johnson purposely hid those findings from the FDA and the public at large.
To this day, even with these records revealed to the public, Johnson & Johnson maintains that their products are safe and asbestos-free, and that any money they've paid out to plaintiffs was the result of confused juries, junk science, and ambulance-chasing lawyers.
Well, understandably, many people think Johnson & Johnson hid those damning findings in order to protect their bottom line. If word got out that one of their products contained cancer-causing asbestos, the company's revenue would plummet.
It's not just Johnson & Johnson that's been caught hiding deadly information from the public. More recently, big pharma giant Purdue was caught working with a consulting firm to put a positive spin on their potentially dangerous opioids like OxyContin. They've also worked to kill stories about the overdose deaths associated with their drugs.
In January 2019, Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey took Purdue's owners to court, claiming that the company engaged in deception and misconduct to push doctors to overprescribe their opioids. And when the addictions and overdoses started piling up, the company laid out plans to get into the opioid addiction treatment market.
Purdue's internal documents called it an end-to-end pain treatment. That is, sell the opioids, then sell the cure to the opioid addiction. Here's Maura Healey speaking about the lawsuit.
Purdue misled doctors, patients, and the public about the real risks of their dangerous opioids, including OxyContin. We also found that they did this with the oversight and direction of 16 current and former executives and directors named in our complaint.
After hearing these stories, it's impossible to deny that Johnson & Johnson and Purdue, two of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the U.S., have intentionally put consumers at risk for the sake of keeping sales figures up. It's not much of a logical leap to wonder if other companies are also putting profits before lives, or if the deception extends to other health problems, like allowing people not only to contract cancer, but to die from it.
When it comes to actual scientific evidence, we don't have a lot to go on to prove that Big Pharma is actively working to keep cancer patients sick. There's even less proof that the FDA is involved in such a con, if it does actually exist.
But many conspiracy theorists believe that the lack of scientific evidence is a kind of evidence on its own. If the regulators responsible for overseeing Big Pharma are also involved in their scheme to keep patients sick, then it wouldn't make any sense for them to release findings pointing to their culpability. In fact, they would try to quash any evidence that might paint them in a negative light and label any proof of their wrongdoings as junk, like Johnson & Johnson did after the asbestos scandal.
So exactly what kind of evidence is Big Pharma trying to hide, and how can we uncover it?
Given the clear-cut evidence that Big Pharma has hidden evidence of their potentially dangerous products from the public, it's not much of a stretch to worry what else they might be hiding. And with the incredible advancements in medical technology over the last 50 years, from prosthetics that respond to nerve impulses, to artificial organs, to the eradication of tuberculosis, some people are still scratching their heads over how a disease as common as cancer could still be incurable.
Dr. Vincent DeVita, former director of the Yale Cancer Center and former president of the American Cancer Society, has an answer. In his 2015 book, The Death of Cancer, he writes, quote, "At this date, we are not limited by the science. we are limited by our ability to make good use of the information and treatments we already have. Only bureaucracy stands between cancer, the killer, and cancer, the chronic but survivable illness.
While the FDA has a responsibility to ensure they don't approve any treatments that might be worse than the disease itself, Dr. DeVita argues that when it comes to terminal illnesses like cancer, it doesn't make sense for the FDA to regulate those drugs with the same intense scrutiny. If a cancer patient is willing to test an experimental drug on themselves, Dr. DeVita believes they should be allowed to do so. At worst, an already dying person dies sooner than expected. At best, the experimental treatment could succeed and save their life.
Dr. DeVita writes, quote, "People are dying not because drugs don't exist, but because they can't get them," end quote. He cites PLX 4032, a melanoma drug slated for trial in 2008. During initial trials, this new drug resulted in higher rates of remission for a previously fatal disease, clearly indicating that it was a superior treatment than any drugs used in the past. But strangely, in the middle of the trials, the FDA suddenly ordered a comparison trial, testing this new drug against an old one to measure its success.
While a comparison trial seems like a standard step to take, Dr. DeVita called the move both absurd and unethical. PLX was achieving remission in patients, which had never been done before. A comparison trial wasn't necessary to understand that. What's more, the trial required that half the patients in the study be given the older, less effective drug simply for the sake of recording some data. This put actual patients' lives at risk.
This comparison trial also lengthened the amount of time it took for PLX to get approved. Had the FDA simply accepted the existing research stating that PLX resulted in remission, the drug would have been ready for approval immediately. Instead, it took another 3 years for the drug to reach the market.
Dr. DeVita argues that if cancer patients are already dying, preventing access to effective, though less tested, drugs does more harm than good. From his perspective, it looks like the FDA is willing to put procedure ahead of patients' lives. But is this something more than bureaucratic inefficiency? Is the FDA actually trying to stop successful treatments from reaching the public?
And that brings us back to the math. Last week, we mentioned that the global oncology market is on track to hit $200 billion per year very soon. This number references the amount patients spend on various cancer drugs and treatments. The overall global healthcare market is many times that, somewhere around $7 trillion annually.
Big Pharma has lots to lose if cancer were suddenly eradicated. Those billions of dollars per year would immediately dry up.
But in reality, it doesn't quite work like that. If a true cure for cancer were discovered, all of those billions of dollars would immediately shift over to that miracle drug, and then some. The first company to come out with a cure would be able to patent it, sell their drug exclusively at whatever price they wanted, and corner the entire oncology market. In fact, a 2006 study published in the Journal of Political Economy estimated that a true cure for cancer would be worth upwards of $50 trillion, 250 times the current annual oncology spending.
So the math doesn't actually add up. And we should also consider the fact that many pharmaceutical researchers aren't for-profit companies to begin with, like university researchers or nonprofits like the American Cancer Society. Those groups don't necessarily operate under an economic incentive, and it would be pretty difficult for Big Pharma or the FDA to bribe everyone involved into hushing up the cure.
It's also worth noting that the FDA only handles drug approvals in the U.S. They have no control over what's researched, discovered, or approved for use in other countries. If scientists elsewhere discovered a cure for cancer, the FDA wouldn't be able to keep it quiet, even if they wanted to. So the fact that cancer isn't curable in Canada or China or anywhere else would indicate that no cure currently exists. Or at least, if someone is suppressing it, It's not the FDA.
Other countries also don't spend nearly the same amount of money on healthcare as we do. As we noted earlier, the U.S. makes up almost half the spending in the entire global cancer market. It stands to reason that pharmaceutical companies in other countries have a lot less clout than U.S.-based big pharma does, and they wouldn't be able to apply the same amount of pressure to keep a cure quiet.
Overall, I give this conspiracy theory a 3 out of 10. There's plenty of evidence that the FDA doesn't always act in the public's best interest, and that sometimes pharmaceutical companies put their profits ahead of safety. But when it comes down to pure dollars and cents, it doesn't benefit either organization to try and keep a cancer cure off the market.
But what if the amount of money that could be generated from a cure didn't matter? What if there was another organization out there with a more nefarious goal than simple U.S. dollars? And that brings us to conspiracy theory number 2. Are rich elite families like the Rockefellers manipulating the FDA into keeping a cancer cure quiet, or even intentionally causing cancer in the general public to carry out their depopulation agenda?
The Rockefeller family is one of the wealthiest families in the world, having initially made their fortune via John D. and William Rockefeller's company Standard Oil in the 1800s. After Standard Oil, the family expanded their enterprises to include banking, politics, and real estate.
It's difficult to convey just how wealthy the Rockefeller family really is. Were John D. Rockefeller alive today, his net worth would be $340 billion, about twice the net worth of Jeff Bezos, the wealthiest person in the world in 2019. It's almost impossible to calculate how much money the Rockefeller family has today, given the sheer number of family members and the business enterprises they control, but it's safe to say that they're still one of the world's largest fortunes.
During the second half of the 20th century, David Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller's grandson, was the public face of the family. A banker and businessman, David was under constant public scrutiny throughout his life for his participation in mysterious organizations such as the Bilderberg Group and the Trilateral Commission. Both of these organizations are small groups of wealthy, powerful figures who get together to discuss problems facing humanity.
Given their secretive and exclusive nature, these groups have been at the center of a number of conspiracy theories throughout the years, most notably that they're conspiring to bring about a new world order, a centralized government in which a single small group controls the entire globe, subjecting everyone to slavery. And a smaller population is easier to control.
As frequent listeners may recall from our episodes on the New World Order and the Illuminati, conspiracy theorists believe wealthy elites attempt to cull the world population by creating global wars, manipulating the economy, and spreading diseases throughout highly populated areas, or perhaps by suppressing the cure for cancer.
David Rockefeller himself has acknowledged his goal of instituting a new world order. In his 2003 memoir, he wrote, quote, "Ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interest of the United States, conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global structure, one world, if you will. If that is the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it."
While many took this quote as a direct admission that the Rockefellers were involved in a New World Order plot, a more likely interpretation is that David was taking a sarcastic jab at the characterization of his philanthropic work as evil or self-serving. As far as population control, this is what David Rockefeller actually had to say about the matter.
One of these positions holds the view that family planning should be banned completely. The second justifies virtually all government policies, including those that use coercive means to limit population growth.
That sounds like something a man who's hiding a secret depopulation agenda would say.
or like something a genuine philanthropist would say.
Well, we may never be able to prove or disprove David Rockefeller's personal intentions, but there is some evidence to support the idea that the Rockefellers have been involved in creating massive public health crises. They've been accused of everything from orchestrating black market organ donations to inventing the Zika virus.
When the World Health Organization announced the Zika outbreak in 2016, many people began to panic. The virus, which is spread through mosquito bites, sexual contact, and blood transfusions, causes symptoms like fever, joint pain, headaches, rash, and microcephaly in infants born to infected mothers. For a few years, the general public was warned to take extra precautions against mosquito bites and to avoid pregnancy if infected.
While Zika virus rarely results in death, its effects can be devastating, especially for infants. And given how suddenly it seemed to appear on the world stage, conspiracy theorists immediately jumped on the idea that the Zika virus outbreak was no accident. Before long, those same theorists discovered that the Zika virus actually was manufactured, and it was patented by the Rockefeller family.
That's not entirely accurate. Zika could be traced back to the Rockefeller Foundation, a private foundation established in 1913 to, according to their mission statement, quote, improve the well-being of humanity around the world, end quote. In 1947, the Rockefeller Foundation Virus Research Institute isolated the Zika virus, which already existed naturally, through a series of experiments in Uganda. The foundation then provided a sample of the virus to the American Type Culture Collection, or ATTC, a nonprofit that preserves and sells microorganisms for research purposes. However, there's no indication that the Rockefellers ever have filed a patent for the Zika virus. They were simply the first foundation to identify it.
Whether or not the Zika virus is actually patented, you can visit the ATTC website and see for yourself that a sample of the Zika virus, ATTC VR-84, is available for purchase for about $600 a pop.
But in order to purchase the virus, you need to be a member of a research facility or a nonprofit, which only further supports the Rockefeller Foundation's claim that their ownership of the virus is only for scientific research purposes.
But if they admit they discovered the virus and are willing to sell it to anyone with research credentials, who's to say the Rockefeller family itself wasn't behind the outbreak? They clearly have the means to unleash the Zika virus into the world, and they might have the motivation as well, either to further their secret depopulation agenda or to make money off the samples they're selling through the ATTC.
But there's no evidence the 2016 Zika outbreak was anything more than a tragic coincidence. Officially, the outbreak started with a tourist contracting the illness in French Polynesia and then traveling to Brazil, where they were bitten by a mosquito, which then bit more people and transmitted the virus from there. More importantly, if the Zika virus were part of a depopulation agenda, it wouldn't be a smart move, as Zika rarely kills anyone it infects.
In that case, let's turn our focus back to a more fatal disease, cancer. If you believe in the Rockefeller depopulation agenda, this conspiracy makes perfect sense. But cancer kills about 20,000 people per day worldwide, racking up almost 8 million deaths per year. And the easiest way to decimate the world population is by simply sitting back and letting cancer run its course.
Of course, this theory relies on the assumption that a cure for cancer exists, and the Rockefellers have enough money to pressure the FDA and Big Pharma into keeping it off the market. As we just discussed in theory number 1, it's highly unlikely that anyone, Rockefeller or not, would be able to coerce the entire global medical community into hushing up something so groundbreaking and so potentially profitable.
But the Rockefellers have something more than money. If the New World Order is really in the works, they could bribe scientists and Big Pharma executives with the promise of power in the new global government, or with the threat of imminent death if they don't obey.
This is one of those claims that's impossible to prove or disprove. But at the root of it, there's absolutely no evidence to support the idea that a cure for cancer exists, or that a shadowy cabal is threatening global oncology researchers into silence.
There are claims from conspiracy theorists that no Rockefeller has ever died of cancer. And given the size of the family, that does seem strange.
But the act of not dying of cancer isn't enough evidence to prove that the Rockefellers are hoarding the cure. As an extremely wealthy and powerful family, they have access to top-of-the-line medical care and guidance, which may have something to do with their impeccable health. Also, some forms of cancer, like breast and prostate cancer, are linked to hereditary genetic mutations. If no one in the family carries the genes for those cancers, they'd naturally be less likely to develop them.
Some people also believe the Rockefellers could intentionally be causing cancer in the general public in order to profit off of cancer treatments while withholding an actual cure. Perhaps they're spreading cancer through a virus similar to the Zika virus.
Again, there's no scientific proof backing up these claims. There are viruses that can lead to certain types of cancer. For example, HIV is known to cause a skin cancer called Kaposi sarcoma. But if the Rockefeller family has a hold on a secret virus that's spreading cancer to the masses, they're doing an excellent job of keeping it under wraps. I can only give this conspiracy theory a 2 out of 10. While it's certainly possible that the extremely wealthy have hidden agendas, we just don't have any hard proof. And we certainly don't have any proof that the Rockefeller family has a cure for cancer, much less that they're purposely hiding it in order to cull the world population.
It's also worth mentioning that the world population currently hovers around 7.5 billion people. While cancer is the second leading cause of death globally, killing 9.6 million people in 2018, that barely makes a dent in the total population. If the wealthy elites are trying to depopulate the planet, they're not doing a very good job.
We have one conspiracy theory left to discuss, and this one pins the blame on an extremely unlikely source. Not Big Pharma, not wealthy elites, but anti-cancer charities. Coming up, we'll dig into the evidence.
Darkness, tragedy, pain. These things hide within every beloved institution, and most people are none the wiser.
Every week, the Parcast original, The Dark Side Of, pulls back the curtain to bring you the most salacious stories and disturbing details behind everything we hold most dear.
You'll learn the dark side of Hollywood, where on the set of The Wizard of Oz, numerous accidents sent actors to the hospital, and Judy Garland was beaten by director and Nazi sympathizer Victor Fleming.
The Dark Side of Music, where Elvis Presley was so obsessed with death that he brought friends to a mortuary at 3 a.m. to look at corpses.
And the dark side of the Bible, which contains stories of demonic giants, unicorns, and child sacrifice. You've heard the good side. Now hear the dark side of.
Search for and subscribe to The Dark Side Of on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. Again, search The Dark Side Of or visit Parcast.com/darkside to listen now. Now, back to the story.
Our third and final conspiracy theory is that nonprofit or charitable organizations like Susan G. Komen and the Livestrong Foundation actually profit off cancer patients and therefore exert their power to suppress any cures for cancer so that they can continue making money off of donations.
As we mentioned before, a large portion of cancer treatment and prevention research is conducted by nonprofits, non-business entities dedicated to particular causes. Nonprofits don't operate in the same way regular businesses do. Any revenue they make from their various business activities is tax-exempt, and any profit they make is generally put towards its overall goal, rather than given back to shareholders.
That isn't to say that nonprofits are simply charities. Some of the largest nonprofits are billion-dollar companies, subsidized by public donations, government grants, sales, and merchandising. And for this reason, Some nonprofits find themselves under public scrutiny, with many people questioning their charitable motives.
Nonprofits, just like any other business or organization, are susceptible to scandals and corruption. You might recall the very public 2009 firing of Feed the Children founder and president Larry Jones. Feed the Children was founded in 1979 with a focus on ending childhood hunger. Operating mainly through donations, Feed the Children distributes food, education supplies, and disaster relief around the world.
While its goals are noble, Jones himself was very much not. During his 30 years as president of Feed the Children, Jones was accused of misappropriating and mismanaging funds, allowing executive staff to take donated goods for themselves, pressuring the media into holding back negative stories about Jones and his family, and overseeing forgery on financial statements. The final straw came in 2009 when Jones admitted that he'd wiretapped the Feed the Children offices to secretly record conversations he had with employees.
The nonprofit eventually sued him for taking kickbacks from vendors, giving himself unauthorized raises, misusing charity funds, and even storing pornography in his office.
During Jones's tenure, charity watchdogs rated Feed the Children poorly, but that didn't prevent the organization from raking in millions of dollars in donations and grants, some of which unfortunately went towards Jones' bad behavior.
Larry Jones and Feed the Children is only one example of nonprofit corruption. As another example, in 2018, Oxfam, a global nonprofit focused on poverty alleviation, was accused of ignoring warnings that some of their aid workers were using funds to hire sex workers and were sexually abusing teenage volunteers.
Across the country, nonprofits, big and small, have been accused of taking donations meant for worthy causes and using them to pad the pockets of the owners.
Part of the problem is that nonprofits aren't regulated the same way that for-profit businesses are, so it can often take much longer for corruption to come to light. And in some cases, with no one scrutinizing the business, it never does.
Which brings us to Susan G. Komen, the largest and most well-funded breast cancer nonprofit in the U.S. Komen is behind the pink gloves you'll see NFL players don during the month of October. They're also behind pink Yoplait lids with the Save the Lids to Save Lives program, and you've probably seen them partner with huge for-profit companies like Delta Airlines and Bank of America.
From 1982 to 2010, Komen spent $1.5 billion on their activities, and for years it was considered one of the most trusted nonprofit organizations in America.
The president of Susan G. Komen for the Cure is resigning. Liz Thompson will leave next month. The organization's founder and chief executive, Nancy Brinker, will move away from day-to-day management to focus more on fundraising and strategic planning.
In 2012, the Susan G. Komen Foundation suddenly announced it would no longer fund breast cancer screening services at Planned Parenthood locations. While Komen defended their decision as a reaction to Planned Parenthood falling under congressional investigation, some people believe that anti-abortion lobbyists had targeted Komen, and the organization folded. The president of Planned Parenthood at the time, Cecile Richards, stated, quote, "We are alarmed and saddened that the Susan G. Komen for the Cure Foundation appears to have succumbed to political pressure."
There was immediate pushback from the public, and the fallout caused the nonprofit to make a 180. Komen renewed its funding for Planned Parenthood's breast cancer screenings, but the momentary lapse caused even staunch supporters to give the organization a second look. Since then, Komen has faced criticism over its sky-high executive salaries, with the last two CEOs taking in over $500,000 each per year. This had conspiracy theorists wondering if perhaps Komen's ultimate goal wasn't the eradication of cancer, but raking in money.
Charity watchdogs started rating Komen less and less favorably, and information began spreading across the internet alleging that Komen misused its funds. Some also accuse the charity of not actually doing anything to advance breast cancer research. A rumor spread that Komen only spent 20% of its revenue on research, with the rest lining the pockets of the board. While the 20% figure is true, an additional 60% was spent on public health education, screening services, and treatment services.
But the damage was done. Donation revenue dropped as much as 80% between 2012 and 2017. Warranted or not, Komen's reputation was tarnished, and conspiracy theorists pounced on the idea that the entire nonprofit was just a front for making money. And naturally, Komen would have an incentive to stymie any advancements in curing cancer, or else their wealth would dry up.
It's important for us to note that there isn't any credible evidence that Komen or any other cancer-related nonprofit has ever tried to quash any research into cancer. We should also point out that the founder and former CEO of Komen, Nancy Brinker, founded the charity in memory of her late sister, Susan Komen, who died of breast cancer at the age of 36. It's incredibly cynical to accuse someone who's built a nonprofit empire in memory of her late sister of working to hush up a cure for cancer.
Even so, Komen has also been criticized for pinkwashing, referring to their extensive pink merchandising. The oversaturation of their pink ribbon, applied to everything from yogurt to bumper stickers, has left a bad taste in some donors' mouths. To some people, it looks like an organization casting an indiscriminate net to increase sales figures rather than to fund research.
Komen does receive money from corporate sponsorships. In 2016, it was estimated that the nonprofit was receiving over $55 million a year from these merchandising deals and corporate sponsors. Most of that money goes back into research, advocacy, and awareness campaigns.
But some critics claim that these sponsorships benefit the companies and Komen more than they benefit breast cancer research. For example, in 2002, American Express debuted a Charge for a Cure campaign, in which they claim they would donate $1 to Komen for every transaction made with their cards. Upon further research, it was revealed that Amex only donated 1 penny for every qualifying transaction. It's accusations like these that lead some critics to accuse Komen and its corporate partners of focusing on marketing and profits instead of finding a cure.
But there's still one more major issue to discuss. Do charitable nonprofits have the power to thwart a cure for cancer, even if they wanted to?
And we're back to the same issue we discussed in Theories 1 and 2. We've already decided that the FDA, Big Pharma, and the Rockefeller family probably don't have the reach to prevent a cure for cancer from coming to light.
And by that logic, we have to assume that the Susan G. Komen Foundation doesn't either. Beyond any discussion of corruption or shady motives, it just isn't realistic to say that a nonprofit organization, no matter how big or well-connected, could single-handedly stop all the world's scientists from coming forward with a cure for cancer.
At the absolute worst, I'd say that Komen makes less progress toward curing cancer than they lead the public to believe, but their advocacy and awareness campaigns still do more good than harm.
Overall, on a scale of 1 to 10, I give this theory a 2 out of 10. While there isn't evidence cancer nonprofits have ever tried to cover up a cancer cure in order to protect their revenue, there are some scandals that may give the average person pause the next time they consider making a donation.
Cancer is an incredibly complicated topic. The disease can take dozens of different forms, all with different symptoms, and all requiring different kinds of treatment.
Add to that the complicated nature of the FDA's drug approval process and its complicated ties to Big Pharma, and it can be difficult to figure out what's fact and what's fiction.
And given the devastating nature of cancer and the great strides modern medicine has made in the last 50 years, it can seem unbelievable that the disease is still around. For some, it's easier to believe there are evil forces at play rather than face the reality that medicine still isn't perfect.
In the end, It just doesn't make financial sense for either Big Pharma or the FDA to try and prevent the cure for cancer from making its way into the public. There's also simply not enough evidence that any powerful family, even the Rockefellers, is hoarding the secret cure for themselves.
And while nonprofits may make some missteps, it stretches the imagination to think that they have the nefarious motives and the global influence to thwart a cancer cure from coming out. We can probably take Susan G. Komen, Livestrong, and the American Cancer Society at their word that they'd like to see a cure just as much as the rest of us.
Overall, we believe the official story. The FDA and Big Pharma, while definitely plagued by scandals and corruption, have all the incentive to work together to find a cure for cancer.
Given the current scientific evidence, it's unlikely that we'll ever find a miracle drug that can fully eradicate the illness.
But for the sake of humanity and for the sake of their profits, independent researchers and pharmaceutical companies are moving us in the right direction.